we are online now. Slavenka, can you see us now?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Then I welcome you on our panel about important books in our age. I apologize, Miloš Živanović from Serbia. He was supposed to be moderator of this panel, but it is a case of COVID-positive person in his family, so we are in the middle of problem. Miloš could not come because of COVID. Now Nikola Madžirov is coming to us. And I know that not only Miloš, but both of you, Miloš and Slavenka, had experience with COVID, personal experience. So we are really in the middle of this epidemic problem, and our festival is faced this problem in these days. So we have changes, and now I am instead of Miloš. So I'm not so good prepared for it, but I hope the very experienced authors will help me. So I introduce very short the panelists because they are too famous that I have to speak long about them. First of all, our guest online, Slavenka Drakulić, is one of the most famous Croatian authors, national and international, because she's one of the most translated authors from Croatian literature abroad. Maybe it's international, most famous, I don't know, because she's also columnist in famous foreign newspapers, and her books are translated in very many languages, and they are dealing about very important issues that also has to do something with our situation in epidemic times. They deal with illness and with body and with women issues, but also with war criminals. And in her books and in her essays, she is dealing in very straight and personal way. She speaks out things that are not spoken out, they are under taboo in the society. But it is her approach to literature to speak really out. And yes, you can find her books in every language that you can imagine. So if you like to read her, please do it. Then our guest from Greece, he read yesterday from his poem trilogy. You heard it also in Albanian translation, very short part yesterday, because there are Albanian translations. He's also translated in very many languages. That is the case also with Nikola Madžirov. So we have a really very experienced authors with us in this panel. Dimitris Lyacos wrote the poem trilogy, and this trilogy is spoken like one of the most important poetic works in last decades in Europe. But today we will not discuss the works of our panelists, but they will tell us their experience with the books in these times. And last but not least, Nikola Madžirov came from Northern Macedonia. Today we are old friends, both of us, and made very many projects together. He is a poet and also translator. And he's also translated in very many languages, so all three of authors are international famous. Nikola is writing about his experience as a Macedonian writer, but also he describes he writes about very anthropological moments in the tradition of his country and of his language. And this in Germany and in German-speaking world, he's the most asked author if it is coming to describe some spiritual moments in understanding of Balkans. So he writes essays too, and in these essays he's very deep in this in this issue, how Balkans functions in the cultural world. There are three of them, and our thema is which books are important for us in these difficult times, and it is not only pandemic, but there are different political stuff. It's not necessary to tell you that we are living in complicated times and complicated age. For me, it was a novel of Philip Roth, Nemesis. In this novel, he describes polio pandemic in America in the 40s. For me, it was an important book to understand behaving of people under pandemic. But I would like to hear you. Some of you had experience also with this illness. What are the important books, what were important books for you concrete in these last 2 years? Slavenka, would you like to begin? You are in Istria, in a very nice environment in this moment. Would you tell us something about?
Okay, thank you very much, Alida. First of all, I would like to greet everybody and to thank the organizers for inviting me. And needless to say, I'm very sorry I couldn't come because I've never been to Pristina, and I would love to come, of course, to the festival. And Alida and I have been discussing about that because we too know each other for many years, and we're also friends. So we have been discussing my coming, but because of the very obvious reason that my movement and everybody movement has been restricted, maybe mine more than the others. I have been living in Istria now for exactly a year. So I came here and in my summer house and stayed here, didn't go out, didn't go to the cities, participated in Zoom all over for conferences, but never really traveling because of COVID. And I also would like to greet Nikola, whom I know, and he's also my translator. And hello, Nikola, and nice to see you at least on Zoom. Speaking about books which were important for me in this period, I would like to make a distinction between the important books that might have been important generally. And I cannot say that I have any idea about what is important to read in these times. The reason is that I think it's very confusing period, and you don't know if you would rather go back to Camus' The Plague, or you would like to read something about economy because we are all aware that perhaps the recession is coming, or you would focus, for example, on the books about the destiny of our planet, because obviously we are living in the times where the weather changes are so dramatic and so astonishing that we cannot but talk about that. And then you should include, or we should include into that also a technological development, which have been very radical, very quick, of course, very helpful in this situation, but also it causes some other problems that were unforeseen. If you, for example, think only about anti-vaxxer movement, which causes many troubles if we are speaking about COVID. Speaking about myself, about my experience of reading this year, I don't think it had been different than before. My routines are always the same. I read a mixture of fiction and non-fiction. I couldn't read for a very long time because I was in a hospital whole May and half of June on respirator a week, so they didn't know if I'm going to survive. But when I recover, my first impulse after about 2 months, because it took me to start to read emails, it took me about a month. And to start to read the short messages and short news, it took me about 2 months. But after that, I pretty much recovered. And first of all, I had this desire to write about my own experience of COVID, and that was my first task. About reading, then I return to it, but not looking for some kind of a solution or recipe or how-to book. One book that I found, it's not one, it's about, I think, 5 books in a box, helpful for me in this first phase of recovery was Viktor Ivančić, Robbie K. 5 books that I read with great pleasure. Of course, I read them all in the papers before that, but I found humor so healing that I, of course, am very envious to everybody who has a humor in himself or herself, and especially if these people can write. And of course, Viktor Ivančić can write, and it's also a kind of political commentary seen through the eyes of the child of Robbie K., who is going to the 3rd class forever, and will go to the 3rd class, I think, forever, hopefully. And also Boris Dežulović, who is not here, whom I read with great pleasure, or Ante Tomić. These are the people who have humor for every situation, and I find it very, very healing. But then I, of course, focus on something that interests me generally. And this is the book that was published a couple of years ago in Croatia, but it came to my hands, but not to my attention. And this is Patria by Fernando Aramburu, who is a Catalonian writer, but writing in Spanish language. And his book was then turned into a series. And it is a very interesting book because it shows, and this is what I think we lack sometimes in our literature, not in experience, because we have a lot of that experience. It's about nationalism, but nationalism from the point of view of ordinary people. How you, from a patriot, become a nationalist and then even a terrorist. And how is the family and the society dealing with that? That was an immensely interesting book for me, for the obvious reason. But then I read some other books. I can list them here, but I think I don't want to, at the beginning, to take too much time, and we can return to that topic, to my little list later on.
Thank you, Slavenka. It is very interesting for me that you mentioned Viktor Ivančić, because he's, of course, with his literary, with his Robbie K. series, there are 5 or 6 books in the meantime, is of course not present in the official Croatian literature. But for me, this Robbie K. is one person, like, you know, Petrica Kerempuh or Till Eulenspiegel, is really one extremely important literary person. But official literature history not recognize Viktor Ivančić. He is on the edge of.
Not yet.
Yeah, but he's really great, and this help of humor, for me, it's important. I have only to ask our technicians, here on stage we cannot good hear. It is. Okay, it is difficult for us to hear. We hear, we do. Yes, we can.
I have a solution. So when Slavenka speaks, maybe I will give you my phone because.
Yes.
So.
Okay.
She's speaking.
Because for us, 3 of us, is for me, because I'm in the middle, is better. But I think for Nikola and for Dimitris is difficult, if it's possible. Okay, but now I would like to ask Dimitris, who is coming for the old ancient culture of the Greece culture, old ancient European culture to us. Can we learn something from the earlier works or our actual books, new books that help us to understand our time? What was your lecture and your experience with books in these last 2 years?
The first thing I would like to say, first of all, I would like to excuse myself because I cannot see Slavenka. She's behind a microphone, so I hope she will excuse me. and I cannot hear her very well because we cannot hear her very well here, and my hearing is not so good anyway, so that deteriorates the situation. She's coming through some noise, and that well, immediately makes me think of something that I would like to speak later on, a Wiener filter, which is an invention of Norbert Wiener, the man who introduced the term cybernetics, and I will speak about that later. So the Wiener filter would be separating the noise from the actual message. This is what we would need now. I would need it personally in order to understand Slavenka better. But yes, if you want to go back to the ancients, yes, of course, we have a very prominent example that could make us understand what happens nowadays, the pandemic. But this is not a book. It is an actual situation, and it is the so-called pandemic. They call it pandemic, but it was not really a pandemic, but because it happened in Athens in 430 BC during the Peloponnesian War, and it exterminated a great amount of the population of Athens and led to the Athenians losing the war against Spartans. Now, I mean, you would ask, I mean, what are, is there a common denominator between the actual situation nowadays and the plague of Athens back then? Well, I mean, Gilles Deleuze speaks about the societies of control, and this would be the first thing that I would introduce today. It's not a book, but it's an article, and it's quite short, and it's called Postscript to the Societies of Control. It was published in the 90s, well, 1990 in French, 1992 in English, I think by MIT Press, and it's just a 6 pages article that explains the transition from the disciplinary society that was obviously handled by Michel Foucault to a nascent society of control as he sees it then. And well, I mean, was there no control in Athens back in 430 BC? I think there was. What was probably missing that we have nowadays and we did not have back then was information. So now we have our very complex systems of information that help us handle the pandemic, so organize better, create a more complex organization that hopefully will lead to the end of the problem shortly. But we are all coordinated in a much different way than we were, because now we have the automated systems and we have the feedback systems, and therefore I mentioned in the beginning Gilles Deleuze, the Postscript on the Societies of Control, and then I would go to speak about Norbert Wiener. Of course, in cybernetics, the most important work by Norbert Wiener is the one which is called Cybernetics, or Control and Communication and the Animal and the Machine. But this is a book that was published in 1948, and it's supposed to be a book for the layman, but really it is not a book for the layman. So 2 years after that, Norbert Wiener published The Human Use of Human Beings, which is, if you like, a more accessible version of of his contribution in cybernetics, and in which you have the pioneering idea at the time of automation and of communication and feedback between the human and the machine. And we're all coordinated in such a way today that I think his books and his ideas become actual. But if I may go back before Nikola introduces, I'm sure his very interesting book there. Before I just let him do that, I will go back to the Greeks once more, and I would like to say that cybernetics comes from a Greek word, which is the word kivernao. So kivernao means to govern, but not really to govern. It means to steer, and it would refer to a boat. So steering a boat. So you have, you have a port, and you want to go to the port, and you have to steer the boat, and there are adverse conditions. You have a wind, and you have waves, and you have incomplete information about what will happen in the future, and you want to steer your boat in order to get there. So there's this feedback, this input and output, and the output becomes input, and the whole thing goes on until you're able to steer your ship to the port. The same way we have to steer ourselves now in a port, which is going to be a port of health and a port out of the pandemic.
It is always interesting to know origins of our nouns and of our
yes,
terms.
and if you go a little further to the etymology, it seems, I mean, the cyber, which is a very famous, first part of a word, because you have cyberpunk literature and cyborgs and all that. The ultimate etymology is unfortunately unknown. It may be connected to primna, which is stern, so the back part of the boat, in which you have the navigator, and he navigates the boat, but it may be a pre-Hellenic word, so we can't really say exactly where it comes from. But certainly it is the equivalent of the Latin govern, which leads to government and governance, and all that.
Very interesting. So the etymology is always like poetry.
Yes, absolutely.
And another poet with us, Nikola. Nikola, what was your experience with the time? What were your books in this time, in the last 2 years? I know you have a difficult time. Can you tell us?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you, Alida. Nice to see you, Dimitris and Slavenka. It's interesting because now we are trying to win over absence, and this kind of gathering, no matter the dimension of distance, is kind of victory nowadays. I would like to say what Dimitris said about Deleuze, and I was exploring a little bit more also about his view on a contemporary way of, let's say, censorship of, and I like that frame he put on the contemporary censorship, that it's very different than the old times, especially we coming from societies where we were just locked. There was a different kind of pandemic of thoughts. We were locked in the cage of the things that we shouldn't say. But Deleuze was talking about another contemporary time way of censorship. He said that it's now times come that censorship means that you're forced to say everything. And I think in that way, in this kind of mathematical dimension of our thoughts, when even the most profound thinking is kind of rooted in mathematics, that's how we enter, unfortunately, hospitals. Before there was a fear of mathematics, and now we enter the hospital with the mathematics of fear. I witnessed myself, I was struggling for life 1 month, seeing people dying around me with the burden of statistics. In a way, they were dematerialized even before their death. They became kind of 1 and 0, thinking only about numbers that they will belong to the other side. In that time, when the struggle was going on, I was trying to come back to the writers that were, in a way, in this situation, that tried to spread their voice behind the window of the hospital room. And when we talk about one of these poets I was reading at that time was Bertolt Brecht, and please let me read one of his last poems, I think even maybe the last poem in 1956, entitled When in My White Room at the Charité, it's the hospital in Berlin. When in my white room at the Charité, I walked towards morning and heard the blackbird, I understood better. Already for some time I had lost all fear of death, for nothing can be wrong with me if I myself am nothing. Now I managed to enjoy the song of every blackbird after me too. So kind of, it's interesting because you try to, your absence from the rituals of life, you try to, in this kind of, I think, circumstances, you try to think more about the voice of the things that will come after you, like the voice of the birds that will sing if the pandemics simply raises you from, also from the statistics of life, being alive, or the voice, the sound, as Walter Benjamin was comparing the walking on the streets through Berlin with the walking on the leaves in the forest, so this sound of physical presence. And I was at that time also reading the book already translated by the last book, poetry book of Michael Kruger, who is struggling also with a disease, heavy disease in these circumstances, and his long poem was full with these details on nature. And it's not kind of pantheism now that that is the seed of nature that you have to put inside you to make you more alive. No, but in a way you became more aware of the fleeting moments and then of appreciating the routines of kind of imposed boredom, what they will put, because in this run for knowledge, for information, the distance, it's not only the distance, we talk about the distance between humans, the distance between human and nature becomes even bigger. There are many books. For example, I would read you just briefly, and then we can talk more with writers I really appreciate, and I'm happy to be with. Sylvia Plath, for example, in her poem Tulips, there are wonderful lines when she says, "The tulips are too excitable. It is winter here. It was winter when I was also there watching the snow. Look how white everything is, how quiet, how snowed in. I'm learning peacefulness, laying by myself quietly as the light lays on these white walls, this bed, these hands. I'm nobody. I have nothing to do with explosions. I have given my name and my day clothes up to the nurses, and my history to the anesthetist, and my body to surgeons. Both Brecht and Platt talk about nothing, about nobody. I think it's more human to be nobody by your will than to be somebody if someone says that you're somebody.
Oh, thank you, Nikola. You opened another perspectives. Also with this information, we have many things to speak about. And I come back to Slavenka Drakulić because it is perfect, it fits perfect to Nikola's choice of Brecht and Platt. The first book I ever read about somebody who is ill and is speaking about it openly, second, not first. I read also Vladan Desnica in his illness book, Spring of Ivan Galeb, and the second was of Slavenka Drakulić. As I was young, she wrote a very famous book about her experience with illness, and it was so fascinating. We open and straight ahead, she spoke these things out. And then you are aware suddenly that the illness and to be near death is really something central, something so important for your philosophical and anthropological place in the world. And maybe only moment to change you how in some way. And that was, for all these years, Slavenka, always your issue, illness and how to live despite of body problems. And now you made also experience like Nikola with COVID, and you wrote also about it. One of the best reportage from the COVID time I read also from your text. You wrote it in the Croatian newspaper. So I read it and I thought, okay, Slavenka in his really own. So she wrote so that you really can understand and feel what it is. So you are author for us in these issues, but which authors are for you important for this?
Do you hear me? Because it's
Yes,
very crucial that all participants can hear me. Otherwise, it's stupid even to talk. Yes, thank you very much for mentioning this book, Holograms of Fear. It was what would today be called, I think, faction. That is a book made from, or autofiction, I don't know, a book from the experience, but also made into a literary work. When you meet with death, when you meet when you are 30 years old, it changes your consciousness and forever. Nothing ever can be the same afterwards, because the whole hierarchy of your values, the whole worldview is different. And what I did at that, it was of course very dramatic, but what happened to me is that at that point I decided I am not very willing to compromise in my life. I want to do the things that I want to do because it is, the life itself is so precious and it's so fragile that I want to be who I am. I don't want to compromise on that. Therefore, from there comes a certain strength, because then you speak out, because already it sounds like a paradox, but the worst thing had already happened to you. Maybe people who lose some very people close to them have the similar experience, but that is how the life had changed in my view. And a person that a writer that I somehow read after these Ivančić that you already mentioned, is another writer who is also fantastic but not appreciated enough. and it's belongs to the Croatian literature. Maybe, I don't know how well translated she is, and how much people in Kosovo know about her. Her name is Irena Vrkljan. And what happened is that sometime into this period of COVID and isolation, she had died. It happened this spring, and she was not also one of my favorite writers, but also a very close friend. So this was an immense loss, and my reaction to that loss was to reread her books, and especially going back to what Nikola said, to poetry, because it seems to me that on one hand, there is this humor that is healing, but on the other hand, there is a poetry. Why poetry? The older I am, and by now I'm very old, so going into this direction of reducing and trying to express the meaning of it all, if you want to say. I don't want to say meaning of life, because this sounds terribly banal, but to meaning of our life and who we really are, the poetry comes closest to it. And somehow I'm not into any longer into long readings of the books and thematics that I have. I know what they're about. It means that I want to come as close to the literature as I could, and by literature meaning really the essence, and that's poetry. That's it, you know. So I envy very much. I'm a very envious person. I envy humorists. I envy poets. That's how it is. So I was rereading one of her last books. Indeed, I think it's her last book. It's called Pjesme, ne pjesme. I have no idea how to really translate it into English, but she didn't write poetry for quite some time. She wrote some kind of novels, novellas, very poetical in her expression, but still. And when her husband died, she was of course, at great loss, because she lived with him for many decades, Beno Velek Mejerović, whom, of course, Alida knew him. I knew him. I don't know if Nikola met him, but it is a kind of melancholy. Her prose is rather melancholic, but her melancholy at the loss of love, at the loss of meaning, at the loss of friends, at the loss, just loss itself. It was for me very, very important to see how, so to say, other writers articulate their losses, because what you feel at this period, perhaps maybe because of COVID, maybe because of my frail health and so on, it's loss, it's losing, it's trying to hear, to understand how the birds will sing after you are no longer here. So this was a very important reading for me.
This is really great that you give us now, and after Nikola, this another stressment of poetry, because it was on my question list. It is poetry, it is what we like to hear now. And then all of you three has this answer that maybe it is really poetry. And we spoke about ancient Greek, this first literature at all, also connected with music, of course, that is eventually most important part of whole literary program, so how to say. And that is interesting, because we see that this experience of very, very important things like life and death, illness and health, suddenly take us to these questions of poetry, of very, very compact and short, but very pregnant speaking, and then always obviously near to music. So that maybe it's really the way for the literature of future, I don't know. But I like to ask you, because you are a poet, is it also your impression that in this, okay, it's not mainstream of publishing. We know, everybody of us know that the publishing is interesting of novels and bestseller and so, but that is industry and that is money. But if we are speaking really about literature and about what moves us and what is important for us, is it for you also poetry and poetic language and poetic expression?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, I've started here to talk about theory, and theoretical texts are, to me, quite important. My background is in law and philosophy. People call me a poet, and sometimes this sounds strange to me, because the trilogy, well, I mean, it's not a very lengthy trilogy. It's 230 pages, and there you have the third book, that is a poem in 14 parts, and, well, I mean, in the first book, I think you just only have one poem, but what seems to be a little different, people used to call it poetry.
Oh, okay.
Because we have a very standard idea about what is prose. So, and even if we find ourselves today on the 21st century, I think when we're thinking about literature, we are thinking in terms of the 19th century, as if, you know, Stendhal and Balzac, well, were the paradigm. Of course, things have changed very much, and well, postmodern literature has its own bestsellers. Experimental literature has become quite famous as well, and there are prominent examples of that. But, well, I mean, I'm placed, you know, sometimes by reviewers as a poet, but others disagree. So there is a, you know, there is a big discussion about, you know, whether I'm a poet or not. But for me, what's important is texts in general, and it doesn't matter whether you want to call it poetry or prose. The same way it doesn't matter if someone is, you know, is a man or a woman. I mean, you know, your gender, of course, you know, plays a role, but it is not the most important thing. We start from the content, and then we can analyze and specify and categorize, but I think this is not the most important thing. Since you spoke about poetry and literary text, if you went to see, you know, did the taste of the public change during the pandemic? Did people started to read, you know, different things they were not reading before? Of course, you will tell me, okay, La Peste of Camus, of course, you know, may have sold more copies last year than it did in the past 10 years. But I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking about, say, well, poetry. Did the poetry taste of the public change? And the answer is, it didn't. Well, you will ask me, how do I know? Well, I know because my agent sent me the Amazon bestsellers when I'm in there, and I check the rest of the books, and they're always the same. It's Dante, and it's Rilke, many times Dante, it's Homer. Homer is there, Euripides is there, and of course, you know, Baudelaire is there. It seems that there is a stability in taste. And, well, I mean, we may ask ourselves why. I mean, older texts, classics, why do we keep reading the classics? And an obvious answer may be that, okay, if I'm allowed to use the term, they contain more condensed information than some of the newer texts. And Nikola mentioned that fleetingly. I think. So you read them, and you keep reading them, and you read them again and again, and there is something there that you have not yet discovered, and you will discover in the next reading. So we're talking about layers. So one layer on top of the other, and you're digging down, and as the context is changing around you, so those books change as well.
And what do you think, how it happened that they have more content? Maybe as opposite to our age of informations, maybe our informations...
Because they are more intricate systems of organization, in a way. I mean, semantically, they are. If you take take Homer, or if you want to take the Greek tragedy, there is the ambiguities in the meanings, and we have that, of course, in contemporary poetry, but it is quite profuse. It is quite profuse. And of course, you have the archetypes, because, they stand in the beginning of Western literature. So, well, I mean, this is a complex question. But certainly they manage to, they are like a mirror that changes every time you stand in front of it. And your reflection seems different every time.
That is great, because now we have also classic poetry, and classic are obviously the texts that are interested us. And what is your, Nikola, experience with, because you are also writer on these traces of anthropological and of myths and of these ancient issues. What is your experience with classic?
And always people, they say that what is the definition of the classic literature? It's like the books that everybody has but no one reads. But I don't think it's true, because in a way they're always placed. In fact, what happens, where I remember, at least in my room from childhood, whether there were glasses, when they would take the glasses out, if there is some kind of funeral or something, or a wedding, they will put books inside, not to be empty. And I think it's a kind of a metaphor that classics is always here to fulfill us when we feel empty. It's always something to return to. In a way, every time we want to underline and something from the things that we read, or to make a comment, and it means by underlining you are freezing it. You will never return to it, because you think, okay, this is it, and it's important, but then so it's ready to forget it now. It's like a memorized a phone in number in our mobile phones. But the classics, in fact, doesn't need to be. That's what the beauty is of it, why it becomes classics, because it always wins against the time on the calendar. It's above the personal time, above the historical time. It doesn't even. I think there are many books that are better documents of all the archives of statistics or official histories, because there is a selection. And they are the voices of the characters that can allow themselves to speak loudly about the things that are quite silent through time. And in that way, my relation to classics is very personal, like you and kind of a secret lover. You love it. When you open it, you start hating it. Then again, you start loving it, but it's always something, as Dimitris said, to find a new layer there. In fact, that's the archaeological consciousness of each writer, to discover things. Nowadays, what was the beauty of all these libraries that we were entering, the labyrinths of the libraries, was to pick up the book that you don't know, to dig out, to discover something yourself. Otherwise, you start kind of generating some resistance towards things that are coming to you from all sides. Again, we are coming back to the capacity of our body to take things. And in a way, that's why I think that some books, for me, for example, while translating the Slavenka Drakulić book, The Body of Abad, became classics, especially in that moment when I was struggling for life, when I received a blood plasma from some unknown man that saved my life. I tried to find the name, I couldn't find, and it was but then I recalled the book of Slavenka, and for me it's classics even before the time decides to become it. Again, we are very personal, not even more personal as readers than as writers, I think, because as a writer you try, sometimes maybe you try to think what it will sound in this language, which is very wrong, because then you put the borders around you. But as a reader, you are free to do whatever you want. Let's go back again to being classical, to have things, but not to use them. And I think this is the biggest passion of our collectioners, and also I think that when I'm astonished how things in different cultures become from functional things, they are becoming artifacts, especially in the United States. This process is so fast, and I'm astonished by it, to be honest, to go in the museum where I see the suitcase of Kurt Cobain or the dress of Superman. But we need here on Balkans, with this burden of classics, of histories, we need longer time for this.
Yes, and well, I mean, I would like to add to that because, and there is another characteristic of the classics, which, well, you may find the metaphor far-fetched. The classics are a little like the internet. What is the characteristic that they share? Well, they are non-localized. So they transcend borders. And now, of course, there is a subtle distinction between the classics and what we call the Western canon. What Harold Bloom made famous, the Western canon. What does belong in the Western canon? And because we're talking about Western literature here, I am completely ignorant of non-Western literature. I may admit that I have read very little things. So what enters the canon and what exits the canon. And what we see is that the books that are part of the canon and stay in the canon are the books that are obviously able to transmit the information, become understood in a different culture, perhaps in a different way, perhaps they will be interpreted in a variety of ways in different cultures, but still they can be translated and transported. So there are great books which do not manage to do that. They do not manage, if you like, to make the borders erode. I'm going back now to an expression by Gilles Deleuze in the postscript of Control Societies. But the classics make the borders erode, and, well, I mean, the books of the canon do. But there's obviously a great discussion about what is in there and what's out there, and you are a literary critic and you can make your own list, and Nikola can make his own list, and Slavenka can make her own list as well. And there is this dialogue in which there is this exchange, and obviously through the dialectics of that, history moves forward to update the canon. So, update the canon, update the organization.
It is interesting bridge now to political issues. We were theory and classic and poetry and also questions of body and health are all somehow connected with politics too. And now we mentioned borders and Western canon. And also I have also to admit that I'm much more better in Western literature, of course, as another one. And by Harold Bloom, I saw that he, of course, didn't know Yugoslav literatures because he took only 2 or 3 authors and he didn't know the Nobel Prize, Andrić, and I think he has Danilo Tišma and one poet and nobody else. So he didn't know. Vasco Popa, yes, Vasco Popa, yes. So only 3 authors, and, for example, Miroslav Krleža, he didn't know, and other authors. So his view was also, of course, narrow, but we are all in this narrow view of Western canon, of course. But to come back to the question of politics, not only pandemic, but we have also very, very difficult issues in the last 2 or 3 years with migrations, with wars, situation in Afghanistan. And for me, in Afghanistan, we saw really totally decline of Western world. On one side, Western canon in literature, but on another side, Western decline in one really unbelievable form. It was for me one of the worst moments to see how they left this local stuff left to die. And I work for some foreign associations and foundations, and in this moment it was clear for me, okay, if it would be in Balkans and when I'm in this moment translator for some foreign organization, they would left me on the same way to die, like they did it with their Afghanistan.
But this is the hypocrisy of the
Yes,
Western world.
yes.
That we use
Yes.
them.
Terrible.
We use them. They are tools, and when they're not useful to us anymore,
yes, we left them. We left them, and it was experience of Balkans. Some translators in Srebrenica had this experience with Netherlands soldiers, so they translated for them, and they could not solve their families. But it was a small example if we compare it with Afghanistan. But it was for me totally clear, okay, to work for them it means they will left you if leave you there if it's okay for them. So
this
it's
is
really
another
terrible.
classic, actually.
Yes.
Since we're talking about classics in
And
literature,
it's terrible.
This is a classic of the Western behavior.
Yes. And what can we do, and which books we can read or write to speak about it, to speak it out, because it is, today on the first panel somebody told, the Albanian author told, but now center is not center more, and this edges and this provincial are coming to center. I don't know if it is true. It would be good to be like this, if we can change center. But it was really terrible view in last month to see it in Afghanistan. And have you ideas with which books, with which texts, with which words we can speak about it? And or maybe theory, maybe essays, maybe journalistic world. Slavenka is journalist. Also not only writer, very journalist with very much experience how to change some things with texts. So maybe you have suggestions also in these issues. Slavenka, can you tell us what you think about it? What
I can. Well, what you can do, I don't know, but the journalist is on forefront, of course, and they report what they see, and that's the most important thing. Because without journalists and without social network, we wouldn't even know what's happening in Afghanistan. But it brings me to, you mentioned one issue, and this is, of course, I feel working for a foreign agencies that I would have been left behind. And maybe you will remember that recently, I think it was presented in Hollywood. It was a candidate for Oscar for the best foreign film, and this is a film by Jasmila Žbanić, Quo Vadis, Alida, which is speaking exactly about that problem, because it's based on a book of a translator, somebody who was translated for UN and left behind. His family was left behind. He mentioned to him make it out, but Jasmila Žbanić made a very serious and very good film about Srebrenica, which I really highly recommend. And there, of course, what you see Afghanistan today. But the other thing that made me, that you did not explicitly mention, but which was even, what should I say, not more difficult, but terrible to see, knowing that those who are in every situation of that kind, who is suffering the most are women, because women are under these Taliban. They are going immediately stepping into their past. I mean, we have seen that in our country. It is possible not only to go forward, it is possible to step back in time. And this is what they are experiencing after having a little taste of what would contemporary life look like. You know, so taking off all these burqas and chadors and going to school, and female children going to school too, and trying to live some kind of a different, I'm not going to say mention politics or democracy or anything, but just a life which is a little bit different. So for me, the question of women living there and how they are going to live on under these circumstances is absolutely horrifying. But you also mentioned the time journals, and that's true, because listening to what my colleagues are speaking about classics and going back to classics, I have to say that I am not going back to classics. The last thing that I read was Daniel Defoe's report on the plague in London, which is for obvious reason, of course. But I'm very much focused on the present. So, for example, the book that I've been reading as of late is, I don't know, Michael Martin's book that was about the biography of Ivo Andrić, that was translated into Croatian, and Vatra u Vatri. This is the Croatian title. And then a book about, which also tells you a lot about today's history. Today, how much do we depend on truth about history, which I think is generally the biggest problem in the former Yugoslav countries. We don't know history, our own history, in terms that we do not know our truth about Second World War, much less than about these recent wars. And that, I think, is a big break, and it's a big obstacle in our lives, because we are, of course, manipulated. It's easier to manipulate with somebody who doesn't know, cannot distinguish truth from myth in its own history. There is this woman, Diana Budisavljević, and also a film about her a couple of years ago, directed by a female director who coincides in name. Her name is Dana Budisavljević. And it's about a woman who opposed the fascism in Croatia, Ustaše regime, by trying and saving about 10,000 children from certain death in camps. And her existence and her work was completely obliterated from history for the reason that she was not a communist. She did not belong to the Communist Party. So when they come into power after 45, they deliberately erase, and there are documents about that, memory about a civil organization, and that the accent is on civil organization, građanska organizacija, that was doing a fantastic job. And perhaps this is the person that saved the most lives in the Second World War. And that's something, of course, to be remembered. So what I want to say is that I'm more, because of my journalist profession, I'm very much focused on the contemporary life. One thing, going back to women, about contemporary life is a subject that was in the books, especially in the literature, not so present in Croatia, and this is the subject of. It was very much present in discussions in the media, because we have a very strong conservative circles close to the church who oppose these kind of ideas about sex and gender issue. And this is a young, or maybe she's not so young any longer, about 40, Ivana Bodražić, who wrote a book, I think in English would be titled A Daughter,
And
a son.
sons, yeah.
About life of a person that wants, first of all, there are several characters, but one of the characters is somebody who wants to change sex, and in that way also to change gender. So what is the inner life of somebody who is going through that process, and also how the society reacts to it. And one of the characters is a person who is in coma, who can hear and understand but cannot react. So she's totally immobilized, lying in the hospital and listening to what's happening around her, woman too. Now, speaking about illness and death and these issues, this is also an immensely, what should I say, not important, but also you need really a good imagination to go in such mind. And so she's, I think, has done a great job there, attacking to taboos that, and all through the female characters. So which I find very important. So no, for me, I don't think we can, and I don't think we are here to give any recipes or prescriptions or directions. We can only witness on one hand, and on the other hand, be rather personal in what we are saying and doing. And I'm not into telling people you should do that or you should do this or you should read that or that or this, because yes, somebody mentioned the every person or in these kind of things. And when you mention canon, I'm a little bit, what should I say, I get nervous about that, because in Croatia, for example, there was a big discussion about what is our canon in literature, in what enters into programs, in the school programs for teaching the language and literature, what is a canon there. So there was again a huge hullabaloo, big discussion, and especially about classics, how much classics are understood by children, how much should you put in, what are the classics, and so very much discussion, which then didn't boil to very much result as usual. So no, from me, I try to stay looking around for what the books that I think speak about contemporary moment. As you know, Andrić is one of the only Nobel Prize winner from this part of the world, but also very mysterious, or what should I say, very mysterious person in terms of politics. He never spoke up. And never also in terms of nationality, to whom he belongs, who is now, when Yugoslavia fell apart, to what peoples, to what, of course, it belongs to all the readers, nationally and internationally, but still, who is he? Because today you define yourself still based on national, that is ethnic belonging. Speaking of which, I was now participating in a festival of world writers in Zagreb, organized by Fraktura by Sejid Serdarević, and Svetlana Alexievich, a Nobel Prize winner, was there from Ukraine, And I think what she is doing also is one of the things that, that is important to look at, because what she's some kind of giant registrator. She's making a register of voices, and you would think, okay, she's only listening and, you know, recording it, but of course it's not only listening and recording. And she spoke, but very personally, about what is happening in the last year in Minsk, and about how the main burden of that revolution, which is an ongoing revolution, is undertaken by women. Women are going out, women dress very nicely, and they go out and protest on a big square in hundreds of thousands. And you know what? And I think this is for a big lecture. When they come home, they leave behind a square without a single piece of paper. It's completely clean. So this is one of the things we should we should think about when speaking about that. And for Afghan women, I'm afraid that, as always, what is happening in these countries, they cannot be, the world cannot do very much for them. They have to do it for themselves. And that's the hard part of it. I'm sorry, I have a problem with my
Thank you, Slavenka, very much. Very, very interesting issues that you opened, but we have no time to speak about all of it. I wanted not to say that it was, for me, interesting to hear that you mentioned Ivana Bodrožić, because if somebody asked me which authors are influenced by Slavenka Drakulić, I would say Ivana Bodrožić. I think she is on your traces in some, not only with this book, but in other books, and also in her position in the society in Croatia. So I would say, okay, that is one of the daughters of Slavenka Drakulić, is also Ivana Bodrožić, and you mentioned her. But now I would like to give you the floor, to both of you, to your last words. There are very many, but both, please.
Very short.
No, well, we're being very polite to each other, me and Nikola, but it's great to meet him because we have been under some of the same roofs in the past year, one of them being the International Writing Program at the Iowa University, but different years. So, you know, we were, well, we have some things to share. Well, yes, I will give him the last word. Obviously, a very interesting conversation. We did not really manage to expand very much. I was about to expand and talk more about Norbert Wiener and cybernetics and automation. I was about to come to the fourth industrial revolution, which is properly, you know, being structured and waiting for us. And I was about to connect our systems of organization, the uncertainty that we are trying to reduce in our societies, trying to go for as much security as possible. So trying to create our societal system of negative entropy, if I may use a term from thermodynamics. And obviously, sometimes when a system tries to do that, keep a maximum organization, leaves others behind or leaves other people outside its borders. And this is exactly what happens with what you described took place in Afghanistan. We kept inside our borders. We felt we cannot take any more people inside because they would, I mean, imagine if we said to the Afghan people, why don't you all come to Europe? what would happen? They would disrupt our organized societies. And we don't want to do that. We don't want any chaos happening. So I just wanted to say that because the coin has a flip side. So we are bound by our own systems. We are part of them. Well, sometimes we're able to see a little further outside, but we are moving towards a situation of increased complexity and organization, trying to avoid wars in our premises, and sometimes not caring if those wars happen outside. And of course, now I'm not to properly connect the ideas of entropy and violence as I would have liked to do. And because I did not really give a tip to the public about, you know, a book of literature, and I hope they will excuse me for that, I would like to suggest a film. And it's a great war film. I think, for me, it's among the best films of all time, but it is little known. I mean, everybody has seen Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola, but I don't know how many of you have seen Come and See by Elem Klimov. Have you watched it, Nikola? It's fantastic. It's an amazing masterpiece. It's a film of 1985, and it is the good thing about it is that it is free on YouTube and good resolution. So and English subtitles. It's a horrific film, and you can see how people are becoming totally dehumanized during war and conflict. I would have spoken again about the techniques of Elem Klimov and how he achieves that. But no matter, people can watch the film, and I think, well, they will get this very strange pleasure out of it, because, you know, you need to have the nerves to watch this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Slavenka mentioned also 2 films, so we have now 3 films, but you have not to tell the film title, but something what you like as the last word.
Well, okay, so we mentioned the voice of woman doing this on East, where it's about revolutions and films, so I have only one name then in mind. This is the great Iranian poetess Farooq Farrokhzad. Unfortunately, she died young, but also she made one beautiful film exactly dedicated to the people ill from leprosy, yes? Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful, I think there is also on YouTube, kind of. So if someone interested, then I will write down later about it. So I think Farooq Farrokhzad exactly unites everything, the revolution, the diseases, her strong female voice, and wonderful poetics. I think she is like Ingeborg Bachmann on the East, kind of powerful woman. And what to say,
Would you suggest the English translation, Nikola?
Yeah, the English. I would write down.
Okay.
It's the only film of Farooq Farrokhzad. It's really about one community of leper people living, and it's so poetic, and in a way, then you forget about the disease. You don't see these people sick at all. It's this beautiful perspective behind the window. Then, just one short trip, briefly, I will tell you. After the revolution in Iraq, I was in Baghdad, wanted to support a poet, Munia Malfakir from Iraq, because I adore Iraqi contemporary poetry, did some translations from English, and we went thinking that now it's time for poetry there. And the first image, when I landed at the airport, there was soldier, American soldier, that asked me what I'm doing here. I said, I'm here for poetry. And he started laughing, saying, your head is $2,000 here. I'm sure you don't get so much money for coming here. He was very right, and then I understood the language of this post-revolution space all around East. In a way, you tried to build something as Munia Malfakia wanted to do it, but then he withdrew from this idea because, in a way, you have to build with the stones from the ruins there. The foundations, unfortunately, still are covered with these ruins. There's no one to clean, as Slavenka said. They have to clean themselves. In a way, the position, our position, like coming from West, was also very wrong. When we went there, we wanted to make these sad faces in order to feel, not to feel, to make ourselves feel guilty for a smile. But the poetess that was coming, the contemporary Iraqi poet, was smiling. It was a great defeat of our mimicry, I would say. And she said, a few days ago I lost my brother. They killed him while he was driving with the family. And I dress, and as you see, I have makeup. Every morning I come out with a smile because that I know dying is not a privilege. It's something very ordinary. Let me finish with one poem, having in mind the refugees, and a short poem written by Fadi Yuda. Fadi Yuda is a Palestinian poet, and he's also a doctor living in United States. He's one of the best translators of Mahmoud Darwish in English, together with Caroline Forchet. She's translated from English, and the anthology that Caroline Forchet did, Against Forgetting, is marvelous. I recommend with all my heart, about the poetry of witness, about wars. Now I think she's working on the second volume. And Fadi Yuda wrote this poem in 2013, published by Copper Cannon Press in the book A Light. It's called Mimesis. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider that had nested between her bicycle handles. For 2 weeks she waited until it left of its own accord. If you tear down the web, I said, the spider will simply know this isn't a place to call home, and you would get to go biking. She said, oh, that's how others become refugees, isn't it?
Very nice. Thank you, Slavenka, and greetings to Istria. Thank you to hearing us. Thank you, Dimitris and Nikola, and good night. That was a very nice poem. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was great.